Alrighty, everybody, welcome to Getting the Answers, episode 9. We're going to be talking about a couple of topics about philosophy, but main one being Maslow and his whole hierarchy of needs. But before we get into all of the nice and good details, I will introduce my co host here, Anna Voltes. And if you're having a good day, go ahead and let everybody know, or whatever is going on with you.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. Uh, so I've got some shows coming up on Saturday with some people. So look forward to that. I'll probably be posting an announcement for that later on. But thank you all for joining us, our beautiful audience.
Yes, thank you. We highly appreciate all of you guys here now or later on. Yeah, both ways count. So you
Indeed.
you have written a philosophy book before, and I would say that you're very much into philosophy, uh, from my understanding, of course. And I've also been interested into philosophy. I don't think I've been in as depth as you have been, but I'm kind of like in the progress of doing so. But one of the first guys I kind of learned about was Maslow and his whole hierarchy of needs that we're going to get into for today's episode. But I first just kind of wanted to ask, like, when did you discover Maslow?
Well, Maslow himself, I haven't really read Maslow, so I'm going to be straightforward with that. So this isn't going to be a critique specifically on what Maslow wrote, although I am familiar with the hierarchy of needs because it is something that is taught in a wide range of places, and there's a lot of criticism for and against it made by a lot of people. Although, for general purposes, people think that it's generally useful, and that's why it is taught in very many schools. However, the way these ideas are usually taught is as ideas themselves, rather than in the reading of the whole book that these philosophers, sociologists, psychologists make. So, in that sense, it's somewhat different from, let's say, literary criticism, where you would read the book that contains the information. However, in philosophy, very frequently, and psychology and sociology and other fields, some people will read the books. Some people instead tend to look at cliff notes, summaries, etc., because very frequently what people are looking for isn't the narrative and the experience of reading a particular work, but rather the actual ideas. People ask themselves, what is the point? And they want to get to the point as soon as possible. And some authors are pretty bad at keeping a consistent depth and tend to be rather flowery with their words, which means that sometimes reading literature related to certain topics is actually not as useful as actually reading, let's say, cliff notes, summaries, critiques, someone pulling out the point of it, an interpretation, an exposition. Um, in other words, what I'm saying is that I haven't read Maslow. However, I am familiar with his ideas to a reasonable degree.
Right, of course. And I'll just like to clarify, just to make sure everybody knows kind of where I stand. I wouldn't exactly say that I know much of anything else besides Maslow's pyramid. We didn't really get into much depth besides it. We was mainly just brought up in my, I guess you could call it philosophy class in high school. And we also brought up a extension of Maslow's pyramid in business, and the whole purpose of that, it was basically this author of the textbook updated the pyramid to fit like how business structure works. And I don't think he was the first person to do this, but Anyway, in this, the whole idea was that a business would take Maslow's pyramid and see that the only thing they really desire and need is these resources, and they don't care about anything else. And for business's sake, that was more all people care about to be happy is money, and they don't necessarily care about like how many breaks they have, or is the break room comfortable, those type of concepts. So those were kind of the only two instances of Maslow that I know, one from a more philosophical, traditional sense, and then one from a more business structure that was in the textbook. So the
Yeah. Although, since we're talking about philosophy, I will say that Maslow's field is psychology. Now, obviously, any field of study has a philosophical element to it. But what's interesting about psychology is that it's different from neuroscience in the sense that psychology is, by some people, considered to be a science, by some people, considered not to be a science, in the sense that a lot of claims made by various philosophers, in particular Carl Jung, who was one of the founders of modern psychology, uh, a lot of the claims made by psychologists are questionable in the sense that they are hard to verify, uh, materially speaking, anyway. So, in that sense, psychology is always something that needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because there is some very useful psychology, and there's also some psychology that can be absolute nonsense. So, I want to point that out because a lot of people, when they hear something with an ology behind it, they might automatically assume that it is something that's very concrete. But in the case of psychology, the study of the mind. Okay.
I could still hear you. I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
Looks like it's back on now. You're still frozen screen, but it's very odd.
Okay. Yeah, I've noticed that there's some sort of visual lag, but you know what? As long as we can hear each other, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean maybe we could here in the future move the time. I don't know if that would necessarily help, but I think there's something about this time where I've noticed that like when I do zooms on other days because it's around this time, there seems to be some connection issues. So maybe it's just 10 o'clock. I don't know why that would be, but maybe override of people on the internet at that time or something. That's my guess.
Could be. But anyway, let's continue on the topic.
Yes, of course. And yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying because most of the time, even when you're talking about the study of mind with psychology, it's more trying to understand new theories or prove concepts or just kind of debate around what why we think we how we think is more philosophy, yes, but even what Maslow was doing, I think, is a little bit of that as well. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is they're still ultimately trying to decide on like theories or concepts, and sometimes these theories and concepts are not exactly proven fully by science by any means. So I definitely get
Yeah,
what you're
yeah. That
saying
they're
there.
still trying to get something that's coherent with the real world. Yeah.
Yes. So if we talk about Maslow's pyramid itself, with the basic concepts of it and how he breaks it down into the way he does, it's hard to come up with a first question for this because there's so many ideas that come to my mind. But I guess, Leonard, the first thing I would say is, do you think the way it's set up by its basic needs being the most important, up to all the way up to the self fulfillment needs being the least important? Like, do you think that that's how the human body ultimately functions? I guess.
Well, here's the issue here. I don't think it's meant to imply that self-fulfillment is less important than the basic needs. I think it's because importance is a value statement. So if you're going to ask me, is that how the human body functions, that's different from asking something regarding a value statement. But the idea is that in order to exercise the fulfillment of the higher needs, you need to first build yourself the lower needs, and then as you acquire the ability to interact with the higher needs, those become more important to you, and that's the development of the person.
Right.
And the lower needs become less important in contrast as you develop.
Right. Yes. Because one of the ways, from my
So
understanding,
there's an yeah
no, no, go on. Oh, you can finish your dot for sure.
yeah so yeah because Maslow never made an illustration of a pyramid. That's something that a textbook made. But an alternative way to illustrate it is as a graph where where you can contrast the intensity of a need with personal development on the other axis, and as you develop, the at the beginning of your personal development, the lower needs, the physiological needs, are highest in the intensity, but as you continue to develop, they dip down and other needs dip up, and that continues until you reach the end of it. So at the very end, as you've moved farther along, you might even be in a position where you would be willing to sacrifice on your lower needs in order to maintain your higher needs. However, that's theoretical here. That's my theory here. But
Right. Yeah, because from
but what
the
I'm saying is the pyramid isn't the only way to illustrate it.
right, no, no, I understand that. And so you were saying that Maslow didn't originally intend to have it as a pyramid, or I want to make sure.
Well, I'm not saying he intended to illustrate it in any specific way. Obviously, he wrote the book and he made a description of the needs, but people take the description and then they represent it visually as a pyramid, as a learning aid, so that people can understand it better, because there's some people that are more visual learners that if they were to read the literature, they might have a hard time understanding it, especially if this is coming from an educational institution. They want people to understand these ideas. So representing them in a way that is understandable is advantageous in that sense. However, I will say that the prominence and the frequent use of the pyramid does correspond to the fact that it is a reasonably accurate representation, or a representation that is understandable to a significant degree, although having multiple waves, let's say one after the other, going up and down, as with intensity on one axis, personal development on the other axis. So as you develop, the higher needs become more important and the lower needs become less important. That's another way to represent it that I think for someone that's more information minded, more mathematically minded, might make it more easy to understand.
Right, of course. Because from my experience of learning about this Maslow pyramid, I've always seen it as, well, the pyramid and the concepts. And basically, the teacher, I don't know if he was just doing it to be oversimplified, because I've learned more things through researching it when I made the video a couple years ago and before today's topic. But basically, the way he described it originally was that it's arranged by your needs and desires, right? So you ultimately always have to have food and water, so that's your most important. Then the next thing that everybody wants, like you compared it to if you get like dropped off in the middle of the woods with no help and no cell phone and whatever, these are what you're gonna want. So it's like you're gonna want food, you're gonna want water, you're gonna want safety and security through, shelter or whatever else. Then you're going to want, well, the next one's a little bit harder. I forget his exact example he used for the next one, but with being, friends and family. But anyway, he was kind of describing it like that, where it's basically your needs are need to be met first before you ultimately can meet your wants. So that's kind of how he described the concept of Maslow hierarchy of needs. And I understood what he was saying.
Yeah,
And I do think there's some truth to it, right? I don't think that he's necessarily wrong, but I do think he kind of oversimplified the concept a little bit.
yeah. Now, obviously, it's a theory of behavioral motivation. That is what motivates people to behave in certain ways. And it is contrasted, or to be more exact, compared with ideas in developmental psychology. In, for example, I would say a useful example would be a newborn infant is very much attuned to his physiological needs more than anything else. Obviously, there are other needs, but if there's a physiological problem, the newborn infant will abandon everything else in order to make known that there's a physiological problem.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I definitely see what you're saying, yeah. 'Cause you're saying ultimately from
Yeah.
the
So
start, those needs are met first, basically.
yeah, that's the primary motivation at the start.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone develops, this changes, and so you get your safety needs at a later point where you're no longer 100% concerned about being hungry, um, being being comfortable, physically speaking, but you're more concerned about perhaps future threats to your safety, and then you develop into your social or belongingness and love needs, and then you develop further, and that's the developmental interpretation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right. I have heard it explained that way before as well. And from my understanding of what Maslow originally intended, and I didn't know beforehand that he didn't ultimately have it as a pyramid himself, but I don't really think that ultimately matters too much because it's interpretation. But I mean, anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked on what I was thinking, but basically, I have heard it explained that way before as well. And then I explained earlier the business approach that I've heard explained as far as putting Maslow's theory into business. And so I've heard it explained several different ways, but I ultimately think they're kind of talking about similar similar things and similar approaches to understanding the idea, because ultimately the idea is that basic needs need to be met first, and then your uh, psycholo- psychological. I always have trouble saying that word. Need to be met through like what you were saying earlier, your loving and belongingness, and then your self fulfillment being your wants and desires ultimately. So I've heard it explained in those ways before.
Yeah, and of course, this idea developed in ways. He was inspired by the philosophy of some members of the Blackfeet Indian Nation and the Blackfeet tribe. And however, ultimately, actually, his hierarchy is actually different from the hierarchy that the Blackfeet made, in that the Blackfeet saw community as being more important than self-actualization, and then the idea of the importance of the culture overall continuing as being at the top of their hierarchy. So it's somewhat different. However, I think one of the reasons why the the communal needs didn't really factor into Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that one was obviously that he was trying to describe human motivations as individualistically as to what motivates an individual, but also the perhaps being a psychologist, he might have been influenced somewhat by Carl Jung, who focused very much on the idea of the self as extremely important in psychology. And that is a common trend in psychology, where because of that, he might have been focused more on introspection and internality rather than externalities such as community. Although this is just speculation that I'm making here. I don't know exactly why he decided to go a different direction here.
Right, because there isn't really too much of community in the pyramid so much. I think it's more of a individualistic approach. And what I mean by that is I think he was taking it very much from the person who's reading this are an individual is this is what they want and this is what ultimately they need because are the opposite. This is what they need and then up to what they want if you're talking about it from a pyramid structure. But I think he was taking it very much from trying to answer the question of what is someone's uh, I don't want to necessarily say someone's wants and desires because I think it's more complex than that. But I think he was trying to understand like how humans work and how they approach their life. I don't know if I'm explaining that necessarily too well, but I think his approach was very much
Yeah,
understanding the one person and not necessarily trying to understand like where someone fits into the puzzle.
yeah. And one thing that's interesting is that there is actually, according to Maslow in his later years, another step in the hierarchy of needs that he thought may have been worth including. And that is the idea of transcendence, of going beyond oneself, because actualization, you're becoming complete in yourself, but transcendence is going beyond yourself and pursuing a greater purpose outside of yourself, because you yourself can only be so great, but transcendence, you have a greater goal outside of yourself. So he ended up actually going into the idea of externalities later on. Um, However, that's usually not included because it's a bit harder to categorize how this would be achieved. Obviously, there's a number of different ways that people interpret this. People see this as perhaps relating to altruism, of helping others, being generous, or perhaps religion serving a higher power. There's a number of different ways that this can be interpreted, including community, perhaps. So it does perhaps roll back to the ideas behind it. But I just wanted to point out that there is an additional step that could be included.
Yeah, I was unaware of that one, but when you said it, I was ultimately thinking of charity. So it's funny that you brought that up as an extension of the example there, because ultimately, if you pass your own once, you might want to give to charity there as far as how that goes. But anyway, I guess the next kind of main question I had about Maslow hierarchy of needs is that do you think he ultimately, and this may be a little bit too broad of a question, and I can narrow it down if you need, but do you think he ultimately answered what he set out to do? And maybe we don't have the same approach to what he set out to do, but
You mean the description of human motivations?
yes,
Uh, I think that he largely is successful in that it is true that a lot of people are very much concerned about their physical survival first, and then after that, work towards perhaps their safety, their immediate personal relationships, the relationship with the broader society, and perhaps improving yourself at a certain level, and then at the end working towards a greater goal. It is true that I would say that naturally speaking, this does make sense to some degree. Now, obviously, I don't think it's 100% complete or accurate, not because of any particular major problem with it. It's just that in some minor ways, there are elements where you can find exceptions, but you can explain the exceptions by perhaps pointing out to the idea of transcendence, or the idea that the hierarchy of needs is largely based on people, on an analysis, people that are sane and that are neurotypical, but people that are atypical may have a different set of priorities. So, in that sense, psychologically speaking, there are exceptions to rules in very many ways, not just the hierarchy of needs, but in other areas. So, in other words, it's useful enough, and that's why it's taught in schools.
right, yeah, because I think he did answer what he set out to do. Because from my approach, I think he was taking a very general individual look. And so basically, it was like, what does a normal person need, and how should their needs be structured? And I think he ultimately did that very well, and kind of answered his question. Now, obviously, there's going to be flaws, and I think there's flaws to every system. And you even mentioned some just before. I don't think any, especially anything in his field of study or any in philosophy itself, and he's not necessarily in philosophy, but no one concept I think is perfect. Is basically what I'm trying to say here. So I think he ultimately answered what he wanted to do, but there's obviously some flaws to it.
Yeah, and of course, psychology is a constantly changing and developing field. So there's obviously always going to be people that dispute ideas, and perhaps someone might come up with a more usable idea in the future, or perhaps not. We'll see what happens. And I know there's already competing ideas as well, but this is the one that's probably most famous and well known. There's other ideas on needs on human development and psychological needs, etc. Now, from the perspective of philosophy, this is obviously somewhat interesting in that, philosophically speaking, a cynic might agree with physiological needs being extremely important, but someone who's more concerned with overall transcendence and greater knowledge, such as, let's say, Plato, might think that the top of the hierarchy is actually the most important, and going down is obviously important and useful. However, the top is why everything else matters. Because in theory, you could eat food, you can sleep, you can drink, but why does it matter? And
We kind of
the
flipped it
the
upside
things
down.
that make all these things, yeah, the things that make all of these things matter are the things that are at the top. So that's why people will die in order to protect something, in order to further a cause. People will sacrifice their needs in order to satisfy something that's much higher in the hierarchy. And I think that that's, from a philosophical perspective, that's something that's very interesting.
hmm I've I've heard similar things to that, and ultimately, I think that is a very interesting argument against the way Basel has it structured, because ultimately he was trying to figure out motivation. Well, this may not be fully but okay, let's put it this way: if he's trying to figure out how humans are motivated, right, then it makes sense from a like survival perspective or from a science perspective, maybe, to have it the way it's structured, because yes, you do need food and water, uh, because obviously to survive. But even if you take the approach like you were saying earlier and almost put it on its head, flip the pyramid, you could say that, well, you only really need water uh, every other day. It's every 3 days, I believe, but let's just say it's every other day. And then food, you only need like once a week if you want to be like extreme. Then your needs are then met because you do have enough food to at least survive, right? Or enough water to at least survive. So then, is that really ultimately the most necessary thing? You know what I mean? So I could definitely see that argument for sure.
Yeah, and obviously, as I described the model that uses a graph, the lower tier values do become less important than the higher tier values as you develop further along. So, in that sense, this isn't a contradiction to his idea, because his idea is regarding psychological motivations, and the question of overall philosophical importance is not the same as psychological motivations. And this is probably why it's hard to get paid as a philosopher, because people care very much about more physical things. However, ultimately, the thing, the things that make everything have meaning are higher up in the hierarchy. And so there's a very strong trend for actualization and transcendence among certain groups that are opposed to perhaps the more cynical, consumerist attitudes, or Epicurean attitudes that some people have. So, for example, I would say Friedrich Nietzsche, uh, who had this idea of the Übermensch, the Overman, in contrast to the last man. And people like to compare the man who actualizes himself and who has goals to accomplish, goals that are greater goals, to the man who simply lives and consumes and doesn't actually produce anything in the end, as the society slowly decays around him. So that's an idea in the in the post-humanist idea. Now, obviously, in non-humanist ideas, the idea of transcendence is extremely important. But I'm just going off on a tangent there.
You know, I definitely understand that for sure. And not to backtrack too much, but only to play devil's advocate to that argument, is it ultimately, you ultimately, in my head, have to go down to a survival approach to how the pyramid was made. And what the reason I say that is going back to like how my teacher used this example is, you know, he said, you know, you're going to need this and you want shelter, blah, blah, blah. It's ultimately like if you give people a blank pyramid and say, you are now on this island, what are your needs, and organize this would probably be created. Something similar, at least. So I ultimately understand it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But then I think it ultimately comes down to
Yeah.
individual motivation.
Yeah, and it is true that, for example, I would say most people would very much prefer their safety to the degree that they would perhaps sabotage higher virtues. And this is something that a lot of people are very critical against. However, it is, I think, pretty obvious that most people do behave in that way. That when push comes to shove, with a gun up against your head, most people would sacrifice something that very many philosophers consider to be a huge tragedy, but that's how things end up working.
Right, for sure. And like we kind of said this a couple times, but I think it ultimately comes down to what individual person's motivations are. Like, I don't think you can create any system or theory that fits everybody's desires or everybody's wants, because there's definitely going to be people that have to have their wants needed before they can do anything else. You know what I mean? And there's definitely people who are much more
Yep.
I don't know what the exact word is, but I guess much more caring to their other people, and have to have their, or have to give to people or share their wealth, or you have that concept of the two different types of people basically. And I think one type definitely fits this pyramid very well, and the other type doesn't necessarily fit this very well, especially when you're talking like a business
Yeah.
perspective of it.
Yeah. I would say that one important application to be made from Maslow's hierarchy of needs politics is that people do very much care about their basic needs and their safety, in the sense that if you create a political system that obstructs people from acquiring, let's say, basic food and necessities, people will become more criminal and aggressive in response to this, because they will seek to fulfill those needs. And in order to fulfill those needs, they necessarily have to go against the authority that constrains them. And that's why I would say two uh, functional forms of government. I won't say successful because success is variable on these systems. There's systems that allow people the unrestricted ability to fulfill their needs, and then systems that provide people their needs. Those are two systems that are compatible with a hierarchy of needs in regards to human motivations. And then a system that is incompatible is a system that deprives people of their needs, because a system that specifically deprives people of their needs is a system that people are very likely to oppose very strongly.
Right. I don't really know if I could ultimately add more to what you said there, because I don't really have anything on that particular talking point there. The next kind of question that comes to my mind is, if you had the opportunity to maybe rebuild the pyramid or make your own, would it look similar or different?
Um, well, in regards to the pyramid, let me just. Hmm. I see. As I said earlier, I don't have any particular problem with it. It's just that it's not all encompassing. So it's reasonably predictively useful, and that is why it is taught in schools. However, it if you were to make a more complex model that had greater predictive powers, it probably wouldn't end up being a pyramid. It'd be something else. So
Right. It'd almost be
that's
like your
all I can
grid.
really say on that. I think it is. Uh, well, again, that's the same as the pyramid. It's just explaining the information.
Oh, okay. So you would
It
have
would have
to
to be different to a greater degree.
right. So you would have to create a whole different, not necessarily concept, but a whole different like medium, I guess, to describe more complex version of it. Because I mean, I was thinking before.
Well, it might have to have more dimensions to it, or perhaps some sort of complex mathematical model.
Right. Because I was thinking
But
before.
what I'm saying is it's reasonably useful, so I don't see a reason to change it.
Mhm.
Uh, it perhaps adding the transcendence that Maslow wanted to add, that makes sense to me. But other than that, I don't really see a reason to change it. If we wanted to make a more complex model, you wouldn't be able to show it as a pyramid. It'd be, I don't know what it would look like. It probably You probably wouldn't be able to model it visually. You'd have to have it as a series of, let's say, if then statements, and you could model it as a data sheet or something. I don't know exactly how it would be modeled, but
Yeah.
if you wanted to have a greater scope of predictability, then perhaps. But
It would be an interesting project
yeah,
to see for sure. Because I think we've kind of already said
yeah,
this throughout the episode here, but essentially I think his the way he set out to do it is very well done, and as you've been saying, that's why it's probably taught in schools, because it's a pretty good representation of at least the average human, and it's hard to necessarily make something better from what he set out to do. And that's kind of how I used it as like the survival example. I don't think you would have the same you would have the same pyramid basically if you use that example. And I think that was his approach. Now, do I think it may be something better? Yes, but I think you would have to ultimately approach it from a different perspective. If I don't think you could take
Yeah.
that basic pyramid and change it from what it is now. So it ultimately have to be something like you were explaining, where you try to get more detailed, or approach it from like a different personality of a human, and maybe you would have a different pyramid.
Yeah, yeah. Now I'll say that in that experiment, I probably wouldn't be the one doing that because I'm more focused on the more philosophical side of things rather than the behavioral psychology. So in that sense, it's not going to be me making that. Although if anybody wants to pick up the idea, then perhaps it's something that if you accomplish it, you can get it published, peer reviewed, and get some good prestige. Perhaps if you make a decent enough model, yours will appear in the textbooks.
Yes, and we'll be
Beautiful
talking about
audience,
it.
talking to you.
Yeah. Hopefully, I'll
Yeah.
be gone out of college by then. Yeah, yeah. But maybe we'll be talking about Maslow hierarchy of needs, comma, I don't know, whatever your name is, part two. But yeah, that
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think it would ultimately have to be those two approaches. Either you would have to make it much more detailed, or just take a different person's personality. Because ultimately, I keep going back to business in my head because it was a very odd representation of what the pyramid was from the traditional sense. But I ultimately think of somebody like Jeff Bezos. Like, would his pyramid look the same? Like, does the way his personality work? Is he view the same needs that the pyramid sets in that order?
Well, the uh, the the way it was produced was that Maslow uh, he studied essentially examples of people that he considered to be uh, the peak of humanity, the master race of people. Although this isn't racialized, okay. And these people are Einstein, uh, Eleanor Roosevelt, Frederick Douglass. So it's not racialized because Frederick Douglass is black. So, but he's essentially taking the cream of the crop, the people he considers to be the best, most achieved people, and he's deconstructing how how their minds work psychologically and extrapolating that and saying that this is probably how people develop into becoming excellent people in that sense. So he, so that's something that people have criticized because he's not looking at people that are mentally ill or neurotic or neuroatypical in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of Maslow's uh, philosophy of psychology, in that he thinks that studying people that are atypical is going to give you slanted results because it's going to cloud your perception. So he prefers to study people that he considers to be neurotypical and well accomplished.
Right. It would make me wonder what a alternative pyramid. I just keep going back to pyramid because ultimately that's what you keep seeing in textbooks and whatnot. But what his alternative structure
Yeah.
would look like for somebody who is maybe clinically insane or something like that.
Well, here's the thing: with someone who's insane, it could literally take any form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
In that
it would be
sense,
hard to make them.
it's something. Yeah, because someone who's suicidal, for example, doesn't really care about his physiological needs because he's trying to end his physicality. That's an example there.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if it would necessarily could be done, but it would definitely be like for mental health resources. It would be maybe something kind of interesting to have the basic one we know of today next to somebody who maybe is suicidal, and just to see what the difference are between the two.
Yeah.
And that would be
Well, the thing is, not everyone that's suicidal is the same. There are some people
right.
that are genuinely suicidal, that they genuinely want to die, and then there are some people that aren't fully suicidal in the sense that, for example, people that take suicide methods that are not very effective, and this is what people like to call a cry for help, where, for example, slitting the wrists is very slow and is easy to interrupt if you get help at the right time. So in some cases, people that choose very slow and ineffective suicide methods uh, might not be subconsciously 100% into the idea of committing suicide. So there's an added level of complexity in the idea that people can be conflicted in their motivations, that people have contradictory motivation.
Yeah, definitely. And
And I think that's actually something that the hierarchy of needs doesn't model: conflicted motivations.
no, I agree with that. It's definitely a very normal person. I don't think you can have really any expectation. Like, I don't think it includes anybody that may be a little bit different. It's very much the. I don't necessarily want to say perfect human, because I don't know if that's exactly what the pyramid represents, but definitely somebody who's the most normal.
Well, that's basically the intention.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, you were explaining as the
Yeah,
perfect, yes.
and that's the criticism that people have against it.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, I definitely approach the pyramid more as the normal person than perfect, but which is kind of funny. Yeah, it, it's hard to argue against the tiers ultimately, as far as approaching it from his intent. But I definitely, throughout this and some research, could see some criticism against it. So I guess one of the questions I had here was, do you think there's something better that models this, or an idea maybe out there that you think fits better?
Um, I don't know. There might be. There probably is. But this is the most famous one, so that's why we're talking about it.
Right.
Eventually, if there is one that models it better, it might become more popular. But that's actually not always true. As psychology is a changing field, and sometimes it can perhaps move in the wrong direction, as we see. Uh, for example, the people that promote trans ableism, where people intentionally acquire disabilities. I don't think that that's healthy. I don't think that that's something that should be encouraged. But that is something that exists and is promoted by some people. I think it's discouraged by most people. There are some people that promote it, and you never know what could happen. We could end up in a situation where that's a very mainstream idea, or it might never be mainstream. But it's hard to predict where psychology will go, because unlike certain other sciences where you're analyzing for effectiveness, and there is a profit motive that directly corresponds with what you produce. For example, in chemistry, people that are involved in chemistry, if a certain compound accomplishes something, then you could make money from it, and it's very easy to demonstrate that it accomplishes something. But in psychology, how you demonstrate whether something is good or bad often depends on your values, on your other philosophical values outside of your understanding of psychology. And that's where you see the debate, for example, on transgenderism, where some people consider it to be something that is virtuous. Some people are extremely opposed. And it depends on values that are external to psychology in order to inform what you end up doing in psychology.
Right. Yeah, I don't. To answer my own question, I don't necessarily know of something similar to Maslow that is better than Maslow, or at least something you could ultimately maybe look at instead of it, because it obviously is super popular, and that's why it's in numerous textbooks, and I've studied it since high school and in college now as well. It's in almost probably every psychology textbook probably that exists. So I don't think that there's something that could ultimately replace it. But ultimately, myself, I'm going to be looking more at maybe some philosophers that talk about motivation, and just to see if I can find something that I agree with more, or at least something that could challenge the pyramid. But as of right now, I don't necessarily know of any out there.
Yeah, if you find an interesting model, perhaps we can do a show on it.
Yep. It'll probably be an interesting show for sure. Because I do like Maslow's pyramid. I definitely want that to be known, because I definitely see why it's used, and I think I understand it for the most part. So I also like that part, because a lot of times with not ultimately psychology, but especially philosophy, it takes a while for me to understand something. So I was able to kind of understand the pyramid a little faster than normal, which is good. So maybe that's a sign of why it stuck around for so long
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. Well, it could be similar to how in schools different atomic models are taught, where obviously the one that people find to be most descriptive is uh, the model that deals with quantum numbers, the principal quantum number, the azimuth, etc., this quantum spin, etc., and that describes electrons as moving in probability fields that have specific shapes, and they can be inside one another and outside one another. But that's somewhat complex. So people talk about the Bohr model, where you have an arrangement of shells of electrons. And while that's true, it doesn't talk about the azimuth of the electrons, or the spin of the electron. So, but it's still taught in schools because it's useful to understand the idea of electrons having different levels of energy. So in physics, there exist these atomic models that are understood to no longer be as descriptive as they used to be. However, they're still being used because they allow people to understand things to a degree to which it is useful.
Hmm.
And that is why they continue to be taught. And they're not taught these things as if they're the absolute 100% understanding of how an atom works, but rather as something that's useful to understand how electrons operate in atoms, even though the way that they're understood to operate is somewhat different.
Right.
But from let's say a basic chemistry class, it's good enough.
For sure. And I definitely know that schools, because I'm in school to be a teacher, there definitely is a big push now, and I think it's been a push for at least a couple years, about trying to include more types of learners. So trying to include visual, kinesthetic, and auditory, all these different types of learners. So that's a good example you mentioned with like different models for chemistry. I think that that's been starting to get a lot more common now because of uh, education, and is starting to realize in the U.S. At least is starting to realize that we need to include different types of how we teach things to make it the most effective. And I also think that that's probably why the pyramid was made, as you explained earlier pretty well. That's probably for that very reason, to try to teach something and make it more of understanding for visual learners too. So that does make a lot of sense.
Well, I think that makes some sense. Although I would say that ideally, if people are delineated into these different types of learning to such a large degree, it would make sense for them to learn in different classes.
So you were saying it would be more effective
And,
to.
and, and
Oh, sorry. Go on.
yeah, yeah, because of the specialization of that. So let's say someone is a visual learner. If someone's a visual learner taking classes that also include kinesthetic explanations might not actually contribute to the learning at all of the visual learner. Uh, Even if there are also visual explanations, only the visual explanations would be helpful. Now, that being said, people are a mixed bag, and that's why it makes sense to teach people differently, but to teach people in multiple ways. But if there are a significant number of people that are too far into one type of learning, it makes sense to have a special class that focuses on that type of learning so that it's more effective. The education system becomes more effective because there's more specialization for the way students learn.
Right. Ultimately, you're kind of describing, and I agree with you. I think that would be the ideal education system, but at least the way public education works in the United States, it's all a little bit tricky to do that for the amount of students. But you're ultimately kind of describing how special education works, and the fact of that they make a individual education plan, or IEP, and essentially that person, through experts and whatnot, figure out what type of learner they are and what works the best, and that teacher has to develop a lesson plan just for that student. And that's kind of the approach of special education that's happening now, at least if there's enough resources. You can get into that whole education argument, and that'll probably be a whole hour long conversation too. But yeah, that's kind of how at
Yeah,
least the
but
special
I
education
think
supposed to work. But
yeah, I think that that's actually how things will probably develop in a similar way that it used to be that everyone of all the children of different ages were in the same class uh, way back in the day, and they decided to divide that up. There will be an increasing emphasis on specialization as society becomes more complex, as technology becomes more complex. And we see that not just in education, we see that in the medical field, in various other things.
for sure, yeah. I definitely think people are starting to become more aware of education in the United States, even from uh, teachers themselves to the average person. Like, people are starting to realize, just especially for the United States, like how far behind we are in education. So I think right now, at least I kind of feel that there's a big push to try to include different aspects, maybe through technology or different teaching, to kind of catch up, so to speak. So maybe just through trying to
Yeah.
become
Well,
better, there'll be more uh, of a system you're describing.
yes. Well, since we've moved on to a topic of education, what are your thoughts on Common Core?
Uh, I don't like it myself. In Texas, especially, they have a very big push for Common Core curriculum, including Texas government. Anybody that lives in the United States probably knows Texas is very proud of itself. um, so we have to take government courses, at least in public education, throughout in high school, and then in college they require you to take Texas government as well to learn about how Texas came about and whatnot, in history and everything. But so Texas pushes a little bit more Common Core, but if you're just talking like basic Common Core, I don't really think that it particularly works very well, because especially by the time you get into high school, you already know like what types of things you like and don't like. You may not know what job you want to get into yet, but you at least know that, hey, I do not like math at all. So the idea that you ultimately have to take math through Common Core may be good to build standards, or build up your toolkit, so to speak. But it doesn't isn't ultimately going to be used for what path you choose. If I'm making sense. So I think if you
Well,
specialize it
my,
more, it might help.
yeah. Well, my thoughts on education and standardization and centralization of it is that, in my view, we could say, let's imagine, for example, that we put complete standardization on a particular industry. And that would mean essentially that there would be competition. But if all the industries are producing the same product and selling them at the same price, uh, then that means ultimately that if it is advantageous, then it's advantageous. But if it's not advantageous, then it's a systemic problem everywhere. So I view education in a similar way, that standardization of education, nationally speaking, means that there will be no competition, or less competition,
Mm-hmm.
on education. Because education, just like business, in business, there's different business models, and they can be effective and ineffective depending on the situation. And I would say a similar thing should be true about education, where there's different education models that can be effective and ineffective depending on the situation. And the way you advance education, rather than for standardization, would be through competition, in my view. Because once you compete, then you can see which models work, which models don't work. And you also have the opportunity for innovation. And if innovation occurs on a small scale, then there's fewer barriers for innovation to occur than, let's say, if it had to occur systemically. But that's just my opinion on education.
I I I agree with that as well. That's taking a different approach from myself, and that's probably because I'm in the system now, and and that's why I don't like taking classes I don't think are necessary. But that's probably why. Anyway, I like that idea, because I do think the government, in the way education's done, doesn't allow for really that much innovation. So if you're not going to allow for schools themselves to maybe see a common theme through like, hey, the people are really struggling here. Let's try to fix it with, using this model. They're not really ultimately allowed to do that. So I don't think that it's very smart, because I think if schools became much more they still hold to standards, yes, because I don't think you could just ultimately say free for all in education and it would go too well. But they have more freedom to try things and to come up with models and practice models and everything. We would be a better education system, because even if you just talk about uh, competition between schools or between districts, uh, basic in education, despite what people think, administrators and stuff always want to come up being the best school with their test scores or whatever else. So if you give schools
Yeah.
more freedom, they're still going to want to push to have better test scores, have better whatever it would be. So you're still going to have the same motivations to keep that up. So I don't think you could go wrong with just allowing for more freedom there.
Yeah, and also if by decentralizing it, you give a greater say to the parents in the community, let's say in voting, etc., then the education system can be perhaps more conformed to the expectations that the parents have. Because if it's fully centralized, then the expectations that the community has for education become lost in a sea of everybody else in the country. But if it's more decentralized, then the expectations that the parents in the community have for it can be addressed in a better way. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah, get much more community involvement as well. Um, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I was
Because
recently
communities don't want their children to be uh, uneducated.
right.
So so by decentralizing it, it makes it easier to appeal to the interests that the parents have in their children becoming educated.
Hmm. No, I mean that definitely
But
makes
anyway,
sense.
I think yeah. So I think we've we're done with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talked a little bit about education. I think we'll stop here for now, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that is perfectly fine. Just real quick before I end for today's
Okay.
stream, for anybody that's listening now, I am hoping to do uh, another stream later today if all goes well for homework, and it's going to be over justice reform. But if you're watching this elsewhere, it may already be up, and you can catch that on my YouTube or whatever else. I am also on Trovo now, so you can find my channel on Trovo at the Breakdown with WB. And I think you already kind of shouted out your stuff there, Anavoltis, but if you want to again, go ahead, or I'll end it here.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly say on Saturday I will be having a stream with Stephen Ignoramus and Carl Emmerich, and it will be at 7 p.m. Eastern. And on Saturday, I will also be having a stream with Bob Doyle, and this stream is likely to occur at 6 p.m. GMT, which I think is 1 p.m. Eastern. But that still has to be finalized, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend Stephen and Garamus and Carl. Y'all have done streams before, and I enjoyed all of them. Y'all make very good content when y'all are together, so I would definitely recommend checking that out for sure.
Yeah, because we disagree so much on, on so many things.
Yep.
But anyway, thank everybody for watching.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful audience. Have a great day.